really close, yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, like everybody here, I think, I've never been to an event like the Convoy to Canberra. As a journalist, I'd covered demonstrations all my working life, but had never experienced anything like it, so it was a truly remarkable event. It's not the same numbers here, of course, but it's the same spirit, and a very interesting, pivotal period of Australian history. Anyway, I'll just go straight into the introduction. The first chapter is called A Time for All Time. The humanitarian crimes committed by Australian authorities against their own citizens beginning in early 2020 will live on in infamy, but it is the people themselves who create a nation's story. On the 12th of February 2022, one of the largest gatherings of Australians in the country's history marched on the National Parliament in Canberra to protest the totalitarianism of the Australian government, chanting, "Sack them all, sack them all." Crowd numbers are notoriously difficult to calculate and prone to distortion. Estimates varied between the demonstrably incorrect official figures of 4,000 to 10,000 up to 3 million. Many estimates settled around the 1.4 million figure. Oh, hang on. Whatever the number, no politician, intelligence agency, police force or political strategist in Australia failed to notice that a massive number of people marched on the nation's capital with a remarkable amount of good cheer, jubilance and camaraderie, character traits which the nation's leaders had failed to show in the previous 2 years of authoritarian derangement. Between 2020 and 2022, Australia was gripped by a madness which was spiritual, administrative, political, social and judicial in its dimensions. This humble record can only do a little to document this seismic shift, a profound turning point in the history of the nation. In the preceding 2 years, many Australians stood up against the rising tide of tyranny, only to find themselves pepper sprayed, bashed by police in repressive dictatorial abuses which made headlines around the world, imprisoned, fined, thrown out of their jobs, socially marginalised and ridiculed in the mainstream media. Across the preceding 2 years, there had been one remarkable demonstration after another, attracting at first tens, then hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands of participants. But if the nation's government manipulated mainstream media was to be believed, they numbered only a few, and all were either nut jobs or conspiracy theorists. Nothing could have been further from the truth, but the protesters from all walks of life were given no credit and no voice until they found their own. There is an odd resonance to the events of this era, as if the destruction of Australia was only an afterthought, that all the millions of people's lives destroyed by megalomaniacal politicians, Pfizer-funded academics and lunatic, overpaid, self-aggrandising health bureaucrats barely even rated a mention in the power centres of the globe. Australia's democracy proved virus thin. Those who claimed Australia was merely a testing ground for techno-fascism gained a new credibility. As former New York Times journalist Alex Berenson put it in his groundbreaking bestseller, Pandemia, How Coronavirus Hysteria Took Over Our Government, Rights and Lives, put it, quote, "At the beginning, panic made sense. Maybe. But within a few weeks, anyone paying attention could see the cure was worse than a disease. We had done more damage to ourselves and the world than the virus ever could. Media hysteria, political partisanship, over-reliance on unproven technology and scientific illiteracy brought the world to the brink of breakdown. Countries such as Australia show just how fragile our freedoms have become. A nation which once prided itself on its laissez-faire approach and the friendly, easygoing nature of its population lay besmirched by a descent into totalitarianism. All the systems Australians had come to rely on failed them at their time of greatest need. Every last one of them. The mainstream media, the social media platforms, the legal profession, the courts, the politicians, the bureaucrats, the medical profession, the police, the military, and not least the universities, with their filthy hordes of snake peddlers and intellectual traitors loyal to their government and vaccine manufacturer funding sources, mopping up massive amounts of public and corporate monies while peddling nothing but garbage. Oh my God. If only it wasn't true. That's what we were saying yesterday. If only we hadn't been right, if only it hadn't come true. Everyone's been vindicated, everyone. In early 2020, seizing on COVID-19 is their excuse. Politicians and health bureaucrats stepped into the forefront of everybody's lives and created absolute chaos. I'll just read a little bit more and call it quits. While repeatedly refusing to release the medical evidence to justify their actions, because there was none, the nation's political leaders inflicted unprecedented restrictions on their fellow Australians. And it was not just the political establishment, but the medical and media establishments which have now been utterly shamed. And there's that famous quote by Charles Mackay, men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one. Churches and places of worship had been closed for 2 years, and these congregations of believers denied a fundamental aspect of their humanity. Equally, for the secular, those who saw their pubs, clubs and beer gardens as their churches had been denied an essential part of being human, the social nature of the species. A fundamental part of the spiritual experience is the realisation that we are not alone. And whether or not that awakening is of the spirit or simply to the commonality of the human experience, significant numbers of participants believed it to be so. The long periods of government-imposed isolation and absence from all normal forms of communality added to the joyful nature of the event. Spiritual wars all have epicentres, and many people, whether of religious or spiritual bent or not, spoke of the spiritual nature of the event. Many of the individuals interviewed by us expressed almost identical sentiments. I was compelled to be here. I was drawn here. I just knew I had to be here. I couldn't not be here. I woke up and God was in my head and told me I had to go to Canberra. I just got in my car and drove. End quote. Local Canberrans who had grown comfortable on the sweat, toil and taxes of the rest of the country were entirely confronted by this gathering of ordinary, good-hearted Australians, the citizens the nation's capital was built to serve. All those apparatchiks who had rained terror and ceaseless restrictions on their fellow Australians, bashing, fining, jailing and marginalising them, now had egg on their faces. They could deny the truth no longer. They had done more harm than good, and the country they were paid to serve would take decades to recover from their self-aggrandising insanities. I'll just read a couple more parts and call it quits. The arrogance of Australian politicians and bureaucrats, the so-called laptop class, towards their working fellows drove deep divisions into the body politic. Despite all the warnings from months of demonstrations in the nation's capital, despite the many cautionary... Despite the many cautionary words from the planet's sharpest minds and leading tertiary institutions, the Australian authorities did not step back from the brink, blindly leading their nation over the cliff. Many thousands of professionals, doctors, nurses, teachers, police and others who had lost their jobs because they refused to get jabbed were among the demonstrators, and yet still the authorities insisted on an absurd medical apartheid against the nation's unvaxxed, marginalising their own citizens while ignoring, quote, the science, unquote, which was now turning rapidly against them. Mainstream media, always the subject of government manipulation, became a primary source of disinformation and fear-mongering. The government offered backdoor funding and tax concessions to mainstream media to peddle their COVID messaging. loyal to their funding sources, trapped by their failing business models and declining revenue streams, the mainstream media lost all impartiality and therefore credibility. You lie by commission or omission, and throughout the period beginning in 2020, the mainstream media lied constantly. Australia became a profoundly dishonest country. With the death toll from suicides, broken businesses and broken lives mounting by the day, the mainstream media helped the nation's politicians literally get away with murder. And thank you. Thank you. It's, yes, it's pretty well available everywhere. Thank you. Oh, before...
Just quickly, John, before you go, Phil was just telling me how hard it was to get this book printed and published. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And what a mammoth effort to get it out in the same year. I mean, incredible work, John. But tell us a bit about the kind of push it was to get this actually published against this system.
Well, is it going? Oh, I like that. I don't really want to go into all the details because I was threatened with legal action and so on and so forth, and so that's one reason why I haven't pushed it very much. It's a slow burn, I think. It's a bit of history, and these things are, as the first chapter says, a time for all time. There are lessons to be learnt from what happened here. Australia became a cautionary tale all around the world as what not to do, and it was just remarkable what happened. I certainly did face some obstructions, and it took me hundreds of hours to work through it, and the book wasn't published until August. It was originally meant to be published before the last election because there was a massive amount of momentum at the time. In some ways, I suppose the authorities succeeded in destroying or crushing a people's revolution, if you like, a movement. But in many other ways, all they did was just splinter it. So it's just gone everywhere. And now, you know, with there are a lot of other factors in play. The turning of Twitter into a free speech platform has led to a cascade of events. YouTube is no longer censoring material. You know, if you look up the song, you know, Bill Gates behind bars now and all that sort of stuff, which is now running freely on YouTube, which would have been banned 5 minutes ago. It's been a remarkably cascading series of events, and it's not just a few Australians that are angry at what's happened. Basically the world, and it's not a few people on the street that are angry either. There's a lot of political and bureaucratic and institutional horror at what has happened. Everybody's been hurt now. Everybody knows someone who's been damaged. The police, the intelligence agencies, the bureaucrats, everyone knows. And now Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci have come out admitting that it doesn't work anyway. So it was all for nothing. I asked in the predecessor to this book, which was called Unfolding Catastrophe Australia, what happens when they realise that it was all for nothing. And we have reached that point. The population is pretty well realising across the board, you don't have to look very far, that it was all for nothing. What happens now is a serious question for the authorities, which they are going to have to help. They are going to have to solve the fiasco that they created.
Thank you, John. Big round of applause. Thank you for enduring and getting this out. This is awesome. Again, Booktopia or Amazon, just to name a couple. Good old Michelle. She's putting a big book together, aren't you? You've taken so many photos of our movement. Okay. We're about to have Phil up in a second to have a chat to us. Phil, if you're... Yeah, right, there won't be a second, buddy. Thanks, John. Awesome. Aussie, Aussie, Aussie! 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 Aussie, Aussie, Aussie! That's the stuff. A fire in the belly right there. Phil, could you come up here, please, champion?